Commander Vethari had served on starships for 30 cycles of her life, and she had seen many strange things in the dark. Spaces between stars. She had seen planets made entirely of ice and worlds where the sky burned purple, and she had met creatures so alien that her mind struggled to understand their shapes. But nothing in all her years of service had prepared her for the human. The rescue beacon had come through on a quiet morning when the ship was drifting through the empty space near the coast near the Tevoskaras made. Velik Nebula and her communications officer had picked up the weak signal coming from a damaged escape pod. "Commander, there is a life form inside," the officer had said with confusion in his voice. "But the readings are strange, and the species signature does not match anything in our database." Vethari had ordered the pod brought aboard because that was the law of space, and no captain worth her rank would leave a living being to die in the cold void. When the pod doors opened and the creature stumbled out, every crew member in the loading bay had taken a step backward. The human was small compared to a Kethrani, standing only as tall as Vethar's shoulder, and she had no fur covering her soft pink skin and no scales protecting her vulnerable body. Her eyes were strange round things that seemed to absorb everything around her, and her mouth was full of flat teeth that looked neither sharp enough for hunting nor strong enough for grinding. She was injured, bleeding red blood from a wound on her head, and she spoke in a sing-song language that the translators struggled to understand. "Please help me," the human had said when the translator finally caught up. "My ship was attacked, and I am the only survivor." Vethari had felt her fur ripple with unease because she knew what humans were. The Galactic Council had warned every species about them. Humans were dangerous, the report said, and they were unpredictable and violent, and they had spread across the galaxy like a plague in the last few hundred cycles. Some species called them Deathworlders because they came from a planet so hostile that it had created monsters. Their world had extremes of temperature that would kill most beings, and their atmosphere was filled with a corrosive gas they called oxygen, and their bodies were filled with bacteria that could destroy entire ecosystems. Protocol demanded that Vethari space the human immediately and report the contact to the nearest council station of Vethari's ship. The Silent Claw was 18 months from the nearest station, and they were on a long patrol mission through empty space. And there was another problem. Crew of 43 included 12 cubs, the children of her officers who were too young to be left behind when their parents went on extended missions. The cubs were watching from behind their mothers, their large golden eyes fixed on the strange creature that had come aboard their ship. Little Myra, the youngest of them all at only 4 cycles old, had pushed forward to get a better look, and her mother, Sub-Commander Yeth, had grabbed her by the scruff of her neck and pulled her back. "What is it?" Mira had asked in her high young voice. "It is a human," Yeth had answered with fear in her words, "and you must stay away from it." The human, whose name turned out to be Elena, had been taken to the medical bay where the ship's doctor treated her wounds with great reluctance. She had dark hair that fell past her shoulders, and her skin was smooth and strange, without any fur or scales to protect it. When the doctor finished his work, Elena had done something that made everyone freeze. She had smiled at the cubs who were peeking through the medical bay window. The little ones had scattered like prey animals because they knew what bared teeth meant in every species they had ever encountered. Showing teeth was aggression, and it was threat, and it was the promise of violence. But Elena had not chased them or growled or done anything threatening at all. Instead, she had lowered herself down to the floor and made her body small, and waited there with her hands open and empty. "I'm sorry if I scared them," she had said to Vethari. "I forgot that smiling looks different to other species, and I only wanted to show them I was friendly." Vethari had not known what to make of this creature. Over the next few days, Elena proved herself to be nothing like the reports had warned. She was quiet and polite, and she asked permission before touching anything, and she spent most of her time in the small quarters Vetari had assigned to her, but the cubs could not stay away from her. Little Myra was the bravest of them all, and within 3 days she had crept close enough to touch Elaine's hand. Human had held perfectly still and let the cub explore her strange soft skin with her small clawed fingers. "You are warm," Myra had said with wonder in her voice. "Humans run hot." Elena had replied gently, "We come from a world where being warm keeps us alive." After that first contact, the other cubs had grown curious too. They would gather outside Elena's quarters and watch her through the window and whisper among themselves about the strange creature. Their ship had rescued Elena, never chased them away or complained about being watched. She seemed to understand that they needed time to trust her. 1 week after her rescue, Elena had approached Vetari with an unusual request. "Commander," she had said, "I would like permission to use part of your ship's food storage." Vetari had tilted her head in confusion because Elena had already been given access to the nutrient paste that the crew ate. For what purpose? Vetari had asked. Elena had smiled again, that strange soft expression that showed her flat teeth. "I want to cook," she had said. The translator had struggled with the word, and Vetari had asked her to repeat it 3 times before she understood what the human meant. "You want to apply heat to food," Vetari had said slowly. "On purpose?" "Yes," Elena had replied. "It is something my species has done since before we had language, and I think your cubs might enjoy watching." Vetari had not understood why anyone would want to burn their food, but she was curious about this strange creature and her strange customs. "Very well," the commander had said. "I will assign you a space near the cargo bay." And so Elena had begun to cook, and everything on the Silent Claw had begun to change. The Kethrani did not cook their food, and neither did any other species in the known galaxy. This was simply a fact of life that no one had ever thought to question. Food was eaten raw if it was fresh, or it was processed through nutrient synthesizers that broke it down into paste, or it was fermented in controlled biological vats that preserved it for long journeys. The idea of deliberately applying fire to organic matter was so alien that most species did not even have a word for it. When Elena had first explained what cooking meant, Lieutenant Kess had stared at her with his golden eyes wide and his fur standing on end. "You burn your food?" he had asked with disgust rippling through his voice. "You destroy it with heat on purpose?" Elena had made that strange barking sound that humans called laughter. "Not burn." She had corrected him gently. "Cook, and there is a difference, and let me show you." She had spent 3 days gathering what she needed from around the ship. The crew watched her with suspicion and fascination as she jury-rigged heating elements from spare parts and salvage containers from the recycling bay and synthesized basic ingredients from the ship stores. Vetari had assigned her a small, unused chamber near the cargo hold, and she had transformed it into something no Kethrani had ever seen before. Elena called it a kitchen. There were metal surfaces for preparing food and containers of different sizes and shapes, and in the center of it all was a flat heating element that glowed orange when she activated it. Fire is the oldest human technology, Elena had explained to anyone who would listen, and we have been using it for hundreds of thousands of years, and it is what made us who we are. The first time smoke filled the corridor outside the kitchen, 3 security officers had rushed in with weapons drawn because they were certain the ship was on fire. They found Elena standing calmly over a metal container, stirring something with a long implement while she hummed a strange melody to herself. The smell hit them like a physical force. It was rich and complex and alive in a way that synthesized nutrient paste had never been. There were layers to it, deep, savory notes and bright sharp undertones, and something sweet hiding beneath it all, almost ready. Elena had said without looking up, "Would you like to try some?" The security officers had fled back into the corridor with their fur standing on end, but the cubs had crept closer. Little Myra was the first to approach the kitchen doorway, and she had stood there with her nose twitching and her golden eyes wide. "What is that smell?" she had asked in her high young voice. Elena had turned to look at her, and that soft smile had spread across her face. "That is food," Elena had said. "Real food, and not paste from a machine. And would you like to see how I make it?" Myra had looked back at her mother, who was watching from further down the corridor with fear and suspicion in her eyes, but Yeth had not called her daughter back, and so Myra had taken one small step into the kitchen. "Come here," Elena had said gently, "and I will show you something wonderful." The human had lifted Myra up so she could see what was happening in the metal container. There were pieces of vegetables floating in a bubbling liquid, and they were changing color as the heat transformed them. "This is called a soup," Elena had explained, "and the heat breaks down the hard parts of the vegetables and releases their flavors and makes them soft enough to eat." Myra had watched with fascination as Elena added pinches of dried plants that she called spices. "These are for flavor," the human had said, "and different spices make different tastes, and cooking is about combining them in ways that make your mouth happy." Over the next few days, more cubs had joined Myra in the kitchen. They would sit on supply crates near the doorway and watch Elena work with the intensity of predators studying prey. But there was no hunger in their eyes, and this was not the desperate need for food that drove hunting instincts. This was something else entirely. This was wonder. Elena never shooed them away or told them to be quiet. She narrated everything she did in a soft, patient voice and explained each step as if she was teaching them something precious. "This is called sauteing," she would say as she moved vegetables through hot oil. "And see how they change color, and that golden brown is the sugars caramelizing, and it makes them sweet." The cubs would lean forward with their ears perked up and their tails wrapped around their feet. "Can we try?" one of them would ask, and Elena would always say yes. She would let them smell the spices and touch the ingredients and feel the warmth rising from her makeshift stove. She taught them the names of things they had never seen before, like onions and garlic and pepper and salt. She showed them how heat could transform a hard root vegetable into something soft and creamy. She demonstrated how meat changed from red to brown as the proteins inside it shifted and locked together. "Why? Does it taste different after you cook it?" Myra had asked one day. Elena had paused to think about her answer. "Because cooking changes what food is made of," she had said finally. "And the heat breaks down some things and creates new things and flavors that did not exist before come into being." The cub had tilted her head in confusion. "So you are creating something new?" Myra had asked. Elena had smiled that warm, soft smile. "Yes," she had said. "Cooking is creation, and it is taking raw ingredients and turning them into something more than they were, and that is what makes it special." Vethari had watched all of this through the security feeds in her quarters. She did not understand what the human was doing or why her cubs were so fascinated by it, but she could see that something was changing on her ship. The cubs were different now, and they talked about flavors and heat and transformation like bees were the most important things in the universe, and the crew had begun to drift toward the kitchen too, drawn by smells they could not name and a curiosity they could not explain. The human was cooking, and the silent claw would never be the same. Myra was always the first to arrive at the kitchen each day. She would come early in the morning, before Elena had even started preparing the ingredients, and she would climb onto her favorite supply crate and sit there with her tail wrapped around her feet and wait. The little cub's mother, Sub-Commander Yeth, had tried many times to keep her daughter away from the human. "She is dangerous," Yeth had said to Myra one night. "The council warns us about humans for a reason, and you should not spend so much time with her." But Myra had looked up at her mother with those large golden eyes and said something that made Yeth's heart ache. "Elena is kind to me," the cub had said, "and she teaches me things, and she never gets angry when I ask questions. And I like being near her." Yeth had not known what to say to that, so she had watched from a distance as her daughter sat beside the human day after day, and she had waited for something bad to happen, but nothing bad ever came. Elena treated Mira and all the other cubs with a gentleness that Yeth had not expected from up in Store's Deathworlder. When they asked questions, she answered them patiently when they made mistakes. She corrected them kindly when they were scared of the fire. She showed them how to respect it without fearing it. Fire is a tool, Elena had told them one day. And like all tools, it can hurt you if you use it wrong, but if you use it right, it becomes your friend. The cubs had nodded solemnly, as if she was sharing ancient wisdom with them, and perhaps she was within a week of Elena starting to cook. 5 cubs had become her regular companions. They would sit in a row on the supply crates near the kitchen entrance and watch her work for hours at a time. Their names were Myra, and Tiff, and Kala, and Vorn, and Little Siri, who was so small she could barely see over the edge of the crate. They were all different ages, and their parents held different ranks on the ship, but in Elena's kitchen, they were all equal. The human treated each of them with the same warmth and patience. She gave them small tasks to do, like washing vegetables or measuring out spices, and she praised them when they did well and encouraged them when they struggled. "You are learning," she would say when one of them made a mistake. "And that is what matters, and no one is perfect the first time." The cubs had never encountered anyone like her before Kathrani. Adults were not unkind, but they were practical and focused on duty, and they did not have time to explain things over and over to curious young ones. Elena seemed to have infinite patience, and she would answer the same question a dozen times without getting frustrated. "Why do you add salt?" Mira asked one day. "Salt brings out the flavors that are already there," Elena explained, "and it makes everything taste more like itself." "But why?" "Because of how our taste buds work, and they respond to salt in a special way." "But why?" Elena had laughed at that, her strange barking human laugh. "Because that is how life evolved," she had said. "And some things just are the way they are, and sometimes the best answer is that it works, and that is enough." Mira had accepted this answer and stored it away in her memory with all the other things. Elena had taught her the cubs were not the only ones who came to watch the human cook. Crew members had begun to find excuses to walk past the kitchen. They would claim they needed something from the cargo bay, or they were checking on a system malfunction nearby, but they always slowed down when they passed Elena's door. The smells that came from her kitchen were impossible to ignore. There was something about the way heat transformed food that spoke to some deep ancient part of the brain. Even the Kathrani, who had never cooked in all their history as a species, found themselves drawn to those scents. Lieutenant Kess, who had been so disgusted by the idea of cooking at first, had become a regular visitor. He would stand in the doorway and watch Elena work, and sometimes he would ask questions in a gruff voice that tried to hide his curiosity. "What is that?" he had asked one day, pointing to a container of dark liquid soy sauce. Elena had replied, "And it is made from fermented beans, and it adds a deep savory flavor to everything." Kess had sniffed the container, and his nose had twitched. "It smells strange," he had said. "Would you like to try it?" The lieutenant had hesitated, and then he had dipped one claw into the dark liquid and touched it to his tongue. His eyes had gone wide. "That is unlike anything I have ever tasted," he had said slowly. Elena had smiled. "That is what cooking does," she had said. "And it creates new experiences and new flavors and new ways of understanding what food can be." One evening, after the cubs had gone to sleep and the kitchen was quiet, Mira had snuck back to find Elena sitting alone. The human was stirring something in a small container, and she looked sad in a way that Mira had not seen before. "Elena?" the cub had asked softly. The human had looked up, and that soft smile had returned to her face. "Hello, little one," she had said. "What are you doing up so late?" Myra had climbed onto her favorite crate and looked at Elena with serious eyes. "Why do you do this?" she had asked. "Why do you cook?" Elena had been quiet for a long moment. "Because food is not just fuel," she had said finally. "And it is love, and it is memory, and it is sitting around a fire with people you care about and sharing something you made with your own hands." She had looked at Mira with those strange round human eyes. "Where I come from," Elena had continued, "feeding someone is how you tell them that they matter and that you care about them and that you want them to be happy." Mira had not fully understood those words, but she had felt something warm in her chest when Elena said them, and she had known. In the way that cubs sometimes know things without being able to explain them, that this human was something special. "Will you teach me to cook?" Mira had asked. Elena had reached out and touched the cub's head gently. "Yes," she had said, "and I will teach you everything I know." And so the lessons had continued, and the cubs had kept waiting beside her, eyes wide, hungry for something more than food. The attack came without warning on a morning that had started like any other commander. Vethari had been reviewing patrol reports in her quarters when the alarms began to scream and the ship shuddered under the impact of weapons fire. Vexer raiders. Her tactical officer had shouted over the communication system. 3 ships coming out of the asteroid field. The Vexer were pirates and scavengers who preyed on ships traveling through empty space. They were not strong enough to attack military vessels normally, but the silent Claw was far from any support, and the raiders must have been tracking them, for Vethari had rushed to the bridge and taken command of the battle. Her crew fought bravely, and her ship's weapons drove off 2 of the attacking vessels, but the third had gotten close enough to deliver a devastating blow before it retreated when the battle was over and the Vexer had fled. Vethari had surveyed the damage. With a sinking feeling in her chest, the engines were badly damaged and would take weeks to repair. Life support was failing in 3 sections of the ship, and the nutrient synthesizers, the machines that produced all of their food, had been destroyed by a direct hit. Her chief engineer had given her the report with fear in his eyes. "We have emergency rations in storage," he had said. "Enough for 17 days if we stretch them, and maybe 20 if we cut portions severely. How long until we reach the nearest friendly port?" Vethari had asked. 22 days at our current speed, and we cannot go faster. With the engine damage, the numbers did not work. They would run out of food before they reached safety. Vethari had gathered her entire crew in the main cargo bay to explain the situation. She had looked at their faces, at her officers and engineers and soldiers, and at the 12 cubs who had clustered together near their parents. "We will begin rationing immediately," she had announced. "And adults will eat half portions and cubs will receive priority. But I will not lie to you, and some of us may not survive this journey." The silence that followed her words was heavy and terrible. Elena had been standing at the back of the crowd, and Vethari had almost forgotten she was there. But when the meeting ended and the crew dispersed to their duties, the human had walked directly toward the commander. "Let me help." Elena had said. Vethari had felt exhaustion and despair weighing on her shoulders. "There is nothing you can do," she had replied. "And the synthesizers are destroyed, and we cannot make new food." "I do not need synthesizers," Elena had said, and her voice was calm and certain. "And I need access to your cargo holds, and all of them, and I need your trust." The commander had wanted to refuse. She had wanted to send this strange human away and focus on the problems she could actually solve, but something in Elena's eyes had stopped her. There was no fear there, and no doubt, and only a quiet confidence that Vethari had not expected. "Show me what you Mean, the commander had said for the next 3 hours. Elena had walked through every storage compartment on this ship. She had examined crates that had not been opened in years, and she had sorted through supplies that the crew had forgotten they had. Her eyes moved quickly, and her hands touched everything, and she muttered to herself in her strange human language, "This is edible," she had said, holding up a fibrous root that had been meant for a botanical research station. "And so is this, and so is this." She had found emergency protein reserves that had been overlooked and decorative plants from the officers' quarters and samples of alien fungi that had been collected for study. Lieutenant Kess had watched her with disbelief on his face. "You cannot possibly know what is safe to eat," he had said. Elena had looked at him with that calm confidence. "Humans have been figuring out what is safe to eat for 200,000 years, she had replied. "And usually by eating it and seeing what happens, and trust me when I say, I have eaten stranger things than this." She had not been boasting. She had been stating a simple fact. Vettori had watched as Elena sorted the salvage supplies into piles. "These proteins can be processed into something nutritious," the human had explained. "And these fungi can be dried and ground into powder, and this grain can be milled into flour, and together they will make food." "But how?" Kess had demanded. "The synthesizers are destroyed." Elena had smiled. "I do not need machines to make food," she had said. "And I only need heat and time and ingredients, and I have all of those things." That night, Elena had begun to cook like she had never cooked before. She worked in her small kitchen without rest, and her hands moved with skill and purpose. She roasted the roots until they were soft and sweet. She boiled the protein reserves with spices until they became a rich stew. She ground the grain into flour and mixed it with water and made flat cakes that could be baked on hot metal. The cubs had gathered at the kitchen door, as they always did, but this time there was fear in their eyes. They understood that something was wrong, and that the adults were scared, and that the ship was in danger. Elena had looked at them, and her face had softened. "Come inside," she had said, "and help me, and we have a lot of work to do." And the cubs had come inside. They had helped. Little Myra had stirred the stew while Elena prepared the next batch of ingredients. Steph and Kala had shaped the flat cakes with their small clawed hands. Vorn had measured out spices with careful concentration. Even tiny Siri had helped by washing vegetables in a basin of water. They worked together through the night and into the next day, and slowly the piles of raw ingredients transformed into food, real food that would keep the crew alive. The smell filled the entire ship. It crept through ventilation shafts and sealed doorways and into sleeping quarters and maintenance tunnels. Crew members who had never approached Elena's kitchen found themselves drifting toward it, drawn by something older than thought and deeper than instinct. Elena worked without rest for 3 days straight. Her eyes grew dark with exhaustion, and her hands trembled with fatigue, but she did not stop. She roasted and stewed and baked and transformed. She made thin, nutrient-dense cakes that could feed a cub for an entire day. She created a thick porridge from processed proteins and salvaged grains that tasted of warmth and safety and home. She stretched every ingredient as far as it could go and found ways to make small amounts of food feed many mouths. The cubs stayed by her side through all of it. They had become her assistants and her helpers, and they worked with a focus that surprised their parents. Mira had learned to judge when the flat cakes were done by the color of their edges. That could measure spices by smell alone. Even little Siri had mastered the art of stirring without splashing. On the 4th day, Elena presented her work to Commander Vethorized. kitchen was filled with containers of prepared food. Enough to feed the crew for 25 days. How is this possible? Vethari had asked with wonder in her voice. Elena had smiled. Tired but proud. Cooking is about transformation, she had said. And about taking what you have and making it into what you need. And humans have been doing this since before we were truly human. The commander had tasted one of the flat cakes, and her eyes had widened. It was not like nutrient paste at all. It was warm and slightly sweet, and it had a texture that satisfied something deep in her soul. This is remarkable. Vethari had said, "This is survival," Elena had replied. "And it is what my species does." That evening, the entire crew of the Silent Claw ate food that had been cooked by human hands. Vethari watched her. Soldiers and engineers and officers closed their eyes as they chewed. She watched them savor each bite in a way they had never savored nutrient. She watched the fear and tension drain from their faces as they realized they were going to survive. The cubs ate with enthusiasm and delight, pointing out the dishes they had helped to make. "I stirred this one," Mira announced proudly. And Elena said, "I did a good job." Sub-Commander Yeth looked at her daughter with new eyes. The cub who had been so curious about that human had learned something valuable. She had learned that survival was not just about being strong or fast or fierce. It was about being clever and adaptable, and knowing how to transform what you had into what you needed. The days that followed were hard, but they were not hopeless. Elena continued to cook, stretching their supplies with skill and creativity. She taught the crew how to ration properly and how to make small portions feel satisfying. She showed them that hunger could be managed if you knew what you were doing. On the 19th day, a Kathrani rescue ship found the Silent Claw drifting through space. They had responded to the distress signal Vethari had sent after the battle, and they had expected to find a starving, desperate crew. Instead, they found 43 healthy individuals and 12 well-fed cubs, and one exhausted human who was still cooking, even as the rescue ship docked. The captain of the rescue vessel had stared at Elena with confusion. "How did you survive?" he had asked. Vethari, commander, had thought about her answer for a long moment. "The humans saved us," she had said finally. "And she fed us when we had no food, and she kept us alive with fire and skill and something I do not fully understand." The Galactic Council would later request a detailed report on the incident. Vethari would spend many hours trying to explain what had happened. How did she justify allowing a human unsupervised access to the ship's resources? How did she explain that her crew had survived on cooked food when no Kathrani had ever eaten such things? In the end, she had written simply, "The human understood something we did not," and she understood that survival is not merely the continuation of biological function, but the preservation of hope. And she fed not only our bodies, but our spirits. And I recommend that the Council reconsider its assessment of humanity. 3 months later, a human transport ship arrived at the station where the Silent Claw was being repaired. Lena was finally going home the morning of her departure. 12 cubs lined up in the docking bay to say goodbye. They had brought gifts for her, small tokens of appreciation that they had made or found. Myra had carved a tiny figurine of a human stirring a pot, and it was rough and imperfect, but Elena had held it like it was precious. "Will you come back?" Mira had asked with hope in her voice. Lena had knelt down, so she was at eye level with the cub. "I do not know," she had said honestly. "But wherever I go, I will remember you, and all of you, and maybe someday you will cook for someone else, and then you will understand what I gave you." Mira had reached up and touched Elena's face with her small clawed hand. Then she had pressed something into the human's palm. It was a single scale, freely given, and in Kathrani culture, this was the highest honor. It meant family. It meant belonging. It meant that Elena would always have a place among them no matter how far she traveled. Elena had looked at the scale with tears in her strained round eyes. "Thank you," she had whispered, and then she had boarded her ship and left. The cubs had watched until the transport disappeared into the darkness of space. They did not fully understand what had happened over the past months. They did not know that they had witnessed something that would change their species forever, but they felt it in their hearts 20 years later. Commander Mira of the Kathrani vessel Warm Hearth stood in her own kitchen. She was older now, with scars from battles and wisdom from experience, and she was cooking. The smell filled her ship, just as it had filled the Silent Claw. So long ago, her own cubs sat on supply crates near the door, watching her with wide golden eyes. "What is that?" her youngest asked. Myra smiled, remembering a human who had smiled at her the same way. "This is food," she said. "Real food and not paste from a machine. And would you like to see how I make it?" Her cub leaned forward with curiosity, and Mira began to teach. She taught them about heat and transformation, and flavor. She taught them about patience and creativity and care. She taught them that food was not just fuel but love and memory and connection. And as she cooked, she understood at last what Elena had given her all those years ago. Not just food, not just survival, but fire. The fire that transforms, the fire that creates, the fire that feeds not just bodies but souls. The human had been cooking, and she had changed everything, and now the fire would never go out.